So next screencast, we're going to look at resisting social influence. Just as a recap before we move on, I'm going to recap what we mean by obedience and what we mean by conformity. So obedience is following orders given by a person in authority or doing what you're told when told by someone of a higher authority. And what is conformity? It's yielding to real or imagined group pressure or showing the same behaviours and attitudes as others in the group. So during this screencast, we're going to look at the exact opposite of obedience and conformity. We're actually going to focus on disobedience and non-conformity. So disobedience when someone does not obey, they do not follow orders, and non-conformity when the person doesn't do what the rest of the people in the group are doing. Now, I'll give you some examples to start with. Top left-hand picture, you've got the man who is circled. He's obviously not conforming to the group around him. Everyone else is doing the Nazi salute, and he's refusing to conform to that behaviour. He's also disobeying because he could have gotten quite a lot of trouble for not following that order. Second of all, you've got the picture on the right hand side. Some of you will recognise this as Rosa Parks, one of the catalysts for the civil rights movement in America. She refused to sit where she was told to sit on the bus, and this sparked off the whole civil rights movement, which has now led to more equal opportunities for white people and people of ethnic minorities. And bottom left, you've got the suffragettes. So they campaigned for votes for women. They didn't obey. The law at the time was that they weren't allowed to vote, and they disobeyed a number of laws, and they chained themselves to buildings. They went on hunger strike to kind of rectify that and change that for the better. So, as I've said, non-conformity means going against the majority, and disobedience means not doing what you are told to do by an authority figure. So why do people resist social influence? Why do they not obey? Why do they not conform when we know that most people are very good at doing so? So first explanation that we're going to have a look at is social support, and the second explanation is locus of control. Now, social support is pretty much what it says on the tin. There is someone else in that situation who is supporting you. Whether they are not conforming or whether they are not obeying, they are also speaking out, not following behaviours or not following instructions, and they act as a support for you to also do the same, to break that majority or to not obey. Locus of control, I'll just go through what we mean by internal and external locus of control first. So on the left hand side, you can see you've got someone who has an internal locus of control, and they believe that they make things happen. They believe that they are in charge. They determine their own future. So they would say things like, look at what I can do. I can make things happen, and my life's not ruled by fate. So internally, they are in charge of their own environment, their own situation, and their own destiny. Right hand side, you can see someone that's got an external locus of control, and they believe that things happen to them. So they might say things like, why does everything happen to me? There's nothing I can do about my future. There's nothing I can do to change things. Why should I bother? It won't matter in the long run anyway. So I've given you a brief rundown of what we mean by social support and what we mean by a locus of control. I would suggest, as you're creating the notes for this particular part, possibly splitting a page into 4 sections and putting social support across the top 2 sections, locus of control across the 2 bottom sections, because you need to split each explanation again into 2. So we're looking at social support now for non-conformity and social support for disobedience. So top 2 sections, non-conformity, disobedience. So, if people feel supported by others, this might be because of the presence of dissenters. If you remember back to Ash's lesson, we looked at unanimity. So if the answer was given unanimously, i.e. all of the Confederates said the same thing, then there was no dissenters there. If there was a dissenter in place, they gave a different answer. So a dissenter is someone that gives a different answer to the majority. Dissenter is a source of defiance. So they're defying the group, they're defying the majority, and this frees the person to give their own opinion or their own belief. You'll remember in Ash's study, that then gave them confidence to say what they thought, the right answer was. So it gives the person confidence to speak out even if their answer is different. So it's important to note the dissenter doesn't need to say the same as what you want to say, but it's the idea that they are defying the majority, and it frees that person to give their own opinion and their own belief. Disobedience. So moving on to the second box on your table. So disobedience, people disobey if they feel supported by others. This is slightly different. So a disobedient model would be a person who would display that disobedient behaviour at the same time, or possibly a little bit before you want to display that behaviour. And the person may or may not copy your behaviour, but it frees the person to act in a disobedient way. Locus of control, just to go into a little bit more detail. So as I've said on the previous slide, locus of control means the extent to which people see themselves as in control of their own lives. Can they affect the outcome of situations, or do they turn out in a certain way regardless of actions? And I'll bring you back to the picture that I've shown you on a previous slide. Bottom left hand side is internal locus of control, bottom right hand side is external locus of control. And in terms of resisting social influence, so people with an internal locus of control are more resistant to social influence, so they're more likely to disobey, they're more likely to not conform. People with an external locus of control are more likely to obey and more likely to conform because they're more affected by the actions of others around them. So internal locus of control refers to the belief that things happen as a result of a person's choices and decisions, and an internal locus of control makes individuals more resistant to social influence. They believe they have a degree of control, and their perception is that they perceive they have free choice over obedience and conformity. They're active seekers of information, so they're less likely to rely on information from others. They're more achievement orientated, so they're more likely to become leaders. And by leaders I mean not followers of instructions. They resist coercion, so they're not coerced by others. Now, in terms of nonconformity and disobedience, as I've said, for nonconformity, they are active seekers of information. Therefore, people with an internal locus of control are less likely to rely on the opinions of others, and they're less likely to conform to a group majority. In terms of disobedience, they believe that they're in charge of their own behaviour and they don't look to others for instructions. They perceive free choice over their actions, and they're more likely to be leaders than follow leaders, as I've said. So, without looking back over the PowerPoint or looking at the pre-reading, make sure that you can explain the difference between disobedience and nonconformity. Make sure you can explain what is meant by internal locus of control, and make sure that you can explain both disobedience and nonconformity using the locus of control explanation. And you need to be able to do that separately. There are two separate explanations, one for disobedience and one for nonconformity. Then make sure that you can explain both disobedience and nonconformity, again using that social support explanation.